call the meeting to order, please. Supervisor McCarthy, would you lead us in an invocation, please, sir?
If you bow your head. Heavenly Father, we gather here this evening in your sight to address the needs of our community. We ask that you grant us wisdom and prudence as we consider the matters brought before us. We ask that you continue to bless this county as you have so generously blessed us for generations. We ask your special protection of all the men and women who serve their fellow citizens, especially those men and women who risk life and limb in the service of their neighbors. We ask all of this in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen.
Vice Chairman Lofton, you lead us in the pledge, please.
Would you please stand and face the flag and join me on our pledge? I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America
And
and to the republic for which it stands,
one
nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. All right, adoption of the agenda. Are there any proposed changes?
We have none, Mr. Chairman.
How would the board like to handle this one?
Motion to approve the agenda as presented.
Second.
Approve as presented. Second. Any discussion? All those in favor, aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed, no. We'll adopt the agenda as presented. Mr. Tibbs, I think you had a special announcement?
Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman, thank you. I'd like to recognize tonight we have a Boy Scout troop with us. We have the members of Troop 159 from Macedonia Church in Stevens City, and they're here this evening working on their citizenship in the community badge.
Thank you, sir. Gentlemen, if you'd like to come forward and introduce yourselves, we're really pleased to have you. Please come forward and tell us who you are.
I'm Jackson Wade. I'm patrol leader and Star Scout.
I'm Jake Lyon, and I'm second to class.
Thank you.
I'm Hunter Mason, and I'm first class.
I'm Nicholas Wade, and I'm scout.
I'm Craig Nakagawa. I'm scribe and patrol leader, and also life.
Well, welcome, gentlemen. Thank you very much for coming and coming forward and introducing yourselves. All right, that will bring us to citizen comments. Anyone sign up?
Yes, sir.
No one. Good. Consent agenda. How would the board like to handle the consent agenda?
Motion to approve the consent agenda as presented.
Motion to approve as presented is our second.
Second.
Any discussion? Supervisor McCarthy?
Aye.
Supervisor Slaughter?
Aye.
Supervisor Wells?
Aye.
Supervisor Lofton?
Aye.
Supervisor Dunn?
Aye.
Chair votes aye, and the motion carries. Flipped over. That'll bring us to Board of Supervisors comments. Are there any? Anyone? All right. County officials. Chief, welcome. Always happy to have you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the board. It's my pleasure to introduce Steve Myshak this evening, but before I go through that, I'd just like to take this opportunity to express my appreciation to the board for helping to make that appointment possible, and all the staff that helped, and Mr. Turney especially for being champion in most of what we needed during that process. So thank you very much to all that was a part of that. Steve's comes to us from Nashville, Tennessee. He went to college there. He's a Vanderbilt graduate. Decided he was going to stay. He's a native Virginian and comes with a wealth of knowledge, a very well-rounded skill set, and will hopefully bring a new and very enlightening view to the Fire and Rescue Department. So we're very excited to have him, and I will offer him to make a few comments and put him on the spot.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, thank you.
Well, thank you. It's great to be here. It's been a whirlwind week and a half so far. Got a chance to be through all the different companies, visit with a lot of staff. There's be a quiz at the end of the week, as I understand, where I have to match all the faces and names. My wife and I, it's been a wonderfully welcoming community, the department and all the parts of the community. So we couldn't be happier. We're thrilled to be here. and looking forward to doing great things with the department.
It's a huge win-win for us, so thank you very much. Welcome. We look forward to working with you. Thank you both for all you do.
Thank you, sir.
All right. Committee appointments, Hanley Regional Library. Mr. Gaylor is eligible and willing. How would the board like to deal with that one?
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, sir.
I would move for reappointment of Mark Gaylor for a 4-year term.
Heard the motion. Is there a second? And a second, is there any discussion? All those in favor, aye? Aye. Opposed, no? That will bring us to the request of Frederick County Public Schools.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a request from Frederick County Public Schools to participate in a future Virginia Public Schools Authority bond sale program for the additional $3.2 million for the replacement Robert E. Ayler Middle School. As the board might recall, at your July 10th, 2019 meeting, you approved the appropriation of the additional $3.2 million. So Frederick County Public Schools is seeking to obtain the $3.2 million through a VPSA bond sale program. The first step in that process is for the governing body of the locality to authorize a public hearing on the authorization to borrow. And so the request before the board this evening is to schedule a public hearing for your October 23rd, 2019 meeting.
All right, you've heard the request. How would the board like to handle?
Motion to approve scheduling a public hearing.
Second.
Motion to approve and schedule the public hearings, or any discussion? All those in favor, aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. We'll schedule the public hearing at the earliest convenience. Bring us to the Finance Committee business. Supervisor Slaughter.
Okay, give me just a second.
sorry?
Give me just 1 second. I just touched my iPad and it decided to move, so hold on just a second.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Okay, the Finance Committee met on September 18th. The following items were considered. First, the purchasing manager requests an update to the county's purchasing policy to be effective November 1st, 2019. The changes are permitted under the Virginia Public Procurement Act and include the following: increase a verbal quote minimum from $1,500 to $2,000, increase the purchase order minimum from $2,500 to $5,000, and increase the formal solicitation minimum from $50,000 to $70,000. The committee recommends approval, and I would so move.
Heard the motion. Is there a second?
Second.
Second. Is there any discussion? Supervisor McCarthy?
Aye.
Supervisor Slaughter?
Aye.
Supervisor Wells?
Aye.
Supervisor Lofton?
Aye.
Supervisor Dunn?
Aye.
Chair votes aye, and the motion carries.
The sheriff requests a general fund supplemental appropriation in the amount of $25,834.85. This amount represents a carry forward of unspent fiscal year 2019 funds for the purchase of a replacement vehicle. The committee recommends approval, and I would so move.
Heard the motion. Is there a second?
Second.
Second. Is there any discussion? Supervisor Dunn?
Aye.
Supervisor Lofton?
Aye.
Supervisor Wells?
Aye.
Supervisor Slaughter?
Aye.
Supervisor McCarthy?
Aye.
Chair votes aye, and the motion carries.
Item number 3, the IT director requests a general fund supplemental appropriation in the amount of $56,000. This amount represents PEG funds to update the presentation equipment in the Board of Supervisors meeting room. This item was originally approved by the Board of Supervisors Technology Committee in May of 2017. No local funds are required. The committee recommends approval, and I would so move.
Second.
And the second, any discussion?
Second.
Supervisor McCarthy?
Aye.
Supervisor Slaughter?
Aye.
Supervisor Wells?
Aye.
Supervisor Lofton?
Aye.
Supervisor Dunn?
Aye.
Chair votes aye, and the motion carries.
Item number 4, the EDA Executive Director requests an EDA fund supplemental appropriation in the amount of $3,000. This amount represents donations received in fiscal year 2019 from local businesses to provide scholarships to the 2019 Employer Expo participants. No local funds are required. The committee recommends approval, and I would so move.
Second.
And second, any discussion? Supervisor Dunn?
Aye.
Supervisor Lofton?
Aye.
Supervisor Wells?
Aye.
Supervisor Slaughter?
Aye.
Supervisor McCarthy? Chair votes aye, and the motion carries.
Item number 5, the Parks and Recreation Director requests a general fund supplemental appropriation in the amount of $50,000 pending grant award in order to apply for a People for Bikes grant in the amount of $10,000 with a $40,000 match requirement to be met with Parks proffer funds. No local funds required. The committee recommends approval, and I would so move.
Second.
Motion is second. Is there any discussion? Supervisor McCarthy?
Aye.
Supervisor Slaughter?
Aye.
Supervisor Wells?
Aye.
Supervisor Lofton?
Aye.
Supervisor Dunn?
Aye.
Chair votes aye, and the motion carries.
And the last item on the agenda, the Finance Director presented the fiscal year 2019 year-end financial information and request a general fund and county capital fund supplemental appropriation in the amount of $4,504,520. This amount represents general fund balance in excess of 20% to be transferred to the capital fund. A public hearing is required. The committee recommended forwarding the item to public hearing, and I would so move.
Second.
Motion is second. Is there any discussion? Supervisor Dunn?
Aye.
Supervisor Lofton?
Aye.
Supervisor Wells?
Aye.
Supervisor Slaughter?
Aye.
Supervisor McCarthy?
Aye.
Chair votes aye, and the motion carries. We'll forward to public hearing.
And Mr. Chairman, that concludes my report.
Thank you, ma'am. All right, that will bring us to a public hearing, outdoor festival permit request of Waveland Farm LLC. Who is this?
I've got it, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, Mr. Tierney.
This is a request for Waveland Farm to hold, at this point, 3 events on the property of Waveland Farm on Marlborough Road in Back Creek Magisterial District. The 3 dates being requested are September 28th from 11 a.m. to 10:30 p.m., October 5th, again from 11 to 10:30 p.m., and then October 19th for the same time frame, 11 a.m. to 10:30 p.m. Staff's had some inquiries from board members, so I think it's probably pertinent for me to try and bring everybody up to speed. This property, as most of you will recall, came in for a special event designation as a conditional use permit. There was a fair amount of discussion at the board level, and ultimately, the board denied that request. The initiation of that conditional use permit request stemmed from some complaints that the planning department had received about events at the property. We did not pursue any enforcement of the violation because the applicant was trying to bring the property into compliance by going forward with the conditional use permit application. When that was denied, we became aware of, through complaints, that at least one event and possibly more were held on the property subsequent to that denial. So it's my understanding that the applicant is seeking this permit as a way to try and continue with events. The application came in with 5 dates being requested, but because of the timeline for advertisement of public hearings, et cetera, and the board's meeting schedule, 2 of those dates have come and gone. So those aren't really before you at this point. It's the 3 dates that have yet to occur that we're looking for a decision on this request for the festival permit. Mr. Chairman can add additional detail if the board would like, but that's sort of how we arrive here this evening. I'm happy to answer any questions if you have them of staff, and I know the applicant is represented here tonight.
Thank you, sir. Questions of Mr. Tierney, anyone?
Mr. Chairman,
Supervisor Dunn.
so just on a review, can you address the questions, or should somebody else, that the applicant had made a request back in 2018, and then they made another request in 2019? Can you just review the timeline and what has occurred?
There was a festival permit granted for the property at some point in 2018. To my knowledge, that event went off without event. I'm not aware that we received complaints. So that was really a non-issue, I guess, at this point. Then there was events held without a festival permit, which we received complaints for. which resulted in our zoning enforcement staff getting involved. A notice of violation was sent to the property owner, and ultimately they pursued a CUP for an event center. Had they received it, would have covered events on the property. With that CUP not being granted, they're kind of back where they started from, and the way for them to legitimize events at this point would be through a festival permit, or a way would be through the festival permit.
And have they had any events since the board denied their CUP?
We've had complaints of at least one event. At this point, we haven't really, thoroughly investigated that to find out whether or not a violation occurred.
Okay, because the reason I ask is because the request tonight also includes dates that have already passed.
Correct.
So that's what I was just asking.
Correct.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Any other questions of Mr. Tierney? Ms. Lehman, is there anything you'd like to add?
I'm Cindy Lehman at the Back Creek District. Thank you for letting me speak. Yes, in fact, we did start our journey back in 2018 with the festival permit. When we did try to pursue, when we tried to
There you go.
pursue
Or that, yes.
our CUP at the first level through the Planning Commission, there was issues regarding the easement that we purchased from Mr. Rinker to be able to use that to access our property. So until that could get resolved, at that point, we couldn't present to the board, so the CUP was tabled. We were informed that we could continue to have events as long as they were 100 people or less, which is what we did. And then we received the notice that we were in violation of the ordinance. So at that point, we immediately sought to obtain the CUP, retain counsel because we felt strongly that we had the right to use the easement that we purchased. That was still denied. So where we are now is to use our existing driveway. I've met with VDOT, and Mr. Lofton was at that meeting to determine a safe way to eliminate Mr. Rinker's objection to using his road and to utilize our own driveway. So based on that meeting and looking at different options, we've sought the use of the Sheriff's Department to provide us traffic control to turn in and to have a right exit only, which eliminates really any hazard that we have. So we have contacted Sheriff Milholland, and he's agreed to support us with the traffic control. We will not use Mr. Rinker's road in any way. It doesn't infringe in his subdivision in any way. And we're just trying to get through this year. That's where we are.
Thank you. Any
Thank you.
questions of Ms. Lehman? Anyone?
Mr. Chairman.
President McCarthy?
Ms. Lehman, you had mentioned that you were holding festivals of 100 people or less because that's what you understood the requirement to be. And it should be my understanding that you're now just carrying out contracts that you entered into at the time that you thought 100 people or less was acceptable?
Correct.
Then can you explain to me why at least two of the events have more than 100 people listed on the application?
That is the maximum that the people tell us, but typically it's far less than that. We didn't want to be misleading in that number because we had booked these with the understanding we thought we were going to get our CUP, and we were up to 180 people. We felt the 125 would be not an issue. So again, we're just trying to honor the county residents that are coming to our farm to have their wedding and not ruin their wedding. That's really where we are.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions?
I guess my question is, after the CUP was turned down, and at that point you knew not to have any more, whether it was 100 or 50 or whatever, you weren't supposed to have any more, but you did?
We had a family reunion.
Pardon?
We had a family reunion,
Family reunion.
yes. But in any time we had anyone,
More than one activity
We had-
between then and now? I'm
we've
just
had
asking.
2 other events, which we had the sheriff come out, which knew we were going to have a few people, more than a normal amount of people, and we did not want there to be any issue using Mr. Rinker's Road, and we contacted the sheriff department to ensure that we had a safe entrance, because our family has been using that entrance.
So you have family reunion and 2 other events?
We had one other
One
event.
other event, and that was a non-family event?
Correct.
Okay.
We did not have time to cancel on that wedding.
Other questions?
I couldn't ruin their wedding.
Other questions of Ms. Lehman, anyone? Thank you, ma'am. This is a public
Oh,
hearing. Would
excuse
anyone
me.
like to comment concerning this proposed festival permit?
I just had one question, if I could please respond to any comments after I sit.
Not after the public hearing, I don't, well, let's do it.
Okay,
We'll
thank
see. Public hearing, anyone? Thank you, sir. We could have your name, magisterial district, and limit your comments to 3 minutes or less, please, sir.
Thomas Hills, and we live at the Back Creek District also. Our property backs up to the Waveland Farm driveway, 500 feet approximately, and our home is about 700 yards or a long par 5 for you golfers from our house to their facility. From what we have seen, they have conducted their gatherings in a very responsible way. There hasn't been any disorder. There hasn't been any disruption, any loud noises. I don't know what these complaints are that you've heard of, but certainly our position physically where our property is, we would be firsthand to hear of anything that was out of order. I think what they're doing for the preservation of the farm, to have a small operation to offset the expenses of a going concern is admirable. I think it should be supported. I think having anniversaries, weddings, birthdays, reunions of families in a historic facility like the barn, dating back to 1845, going back to the 1700s when Lord Fairfax granted the land, I think is admirable. I think more farmers should be able to do this kind of function or something along those lines, just to be able to keep the farm and the open space available in the county. So it's their dream to have this going on, and it's their dream to continue with this. And I think the board should support their dream as we do. All right?
Thank you
Any
very much, sir.
questions?
Appreciate it. We don't do that one.
You don't do that?
No, sir. Thank you.
Thank you.
Public hearing, we're here to listen. Would anyone like, yes, ma'am?
Good evening.
Pull up microphone, there you go.
My name is Pam Simmers, and I live in the Back Creek District. I am at 186 Heights Road, and I have been there for 30 years. If you walk down my driveway across Heights Road and walk through the field or the orchard for about 10 minutes, I'll be at Cindy's back door. I've known the Lamans and the Hueys most of the 30 years we've lived there. The only way I know that they're having a wedding is if I happen to drive by their house and see the tent out front. I've never heard any loud noises. I do hear noises from the winery, which is on the other side of me, but I've never heard any noise coming from the Lamans. I go over there quite often to check in on Mrs. Huey, and I've never seen any trash, anything out of order. They take such good care of the property. I've had the pleasure of being at 2 of the events that they've held, and it's just a beautiful place, and I think it's a good choice they give the residents of their county to have their events. For example, one of my sons and his wife got married, and before a lot of these barn weddings were popular, and they had to go out to Middleburg to have their wedding and pay just exorbitant amount of money to be married under a tree. So I think this is a great thing that they're doing. And I think the committee should absolutely support them, as I do.
Thank you. Is there anyone else who would like to speak concerning this festival permit?
Good evening, I'm Dudley Rinker, I'm Back Creek, representing Rinker Properties. We were here about 6 weeks ago for this whole thing before, opposed to it at that time. I didn't know anything of this part until about 5 o'clock this evening, so I'm not very well prepared. They have had 2 events since that August meeting, August 7th and again this past weekend. They did have a deputy sitting at the top of the hill, again on our property, with lights flashing, and is that at county's expense? Are they paying for that or whatever? We are opposed to it. We just don't want to be setting a precedent that we're okay with this with the event center in the future. I know that there's another neighbor in the same subdivision as the person that spoke, and he was wondering where all the noise was coming from after the last meeting. I told him where it was. And, he was surprised, and so he has heard the noise from the event center. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Is there anyone else who would like to speak concerning this festival permit application? Welcome.
Hi, thank you. I'm Debbie Ramey. I'm Back Creek District also.
Ms. Bailey, move just a little further. There you go. That's good.
I'm Cindy's sister. I had the pleasure of growing up at Waveland Farm my whole life. To take that barn away from all our people in Frederick County and all around us is a sad, sad thing. We've had parties there since I was a little child. And there's no more noise or any noise that I've ever heard or seen. Our house has never been disrupted in any way. It's never been a negative impact on any of us. And we're very proud that Cindy's undertaken this thing. And speaking of noise, Mr. Rinker has a lot of noise at his events and a lot of traffic and other chaotic issues that he should deal with and not really worry with ours.
Is there anyone else who would like to comment concerning this application? Anyone? Anyone at all? Is there anything you'd like to address that you've heard, Ms. Lehman?
I would just,
We can't hear you until you get to the microphone.
I'm sorry, I'm a little nervous. I would like to address the other complaint from another neighbor. I've never received any complaints verbally or in writing. I actually had 6 letters submitted to the board at the last CUP from neighboring properties, all in support of our venue. So I'm curious as to who Mr. Rinker's speaking with, and if they did have an issue, I'd be more than willing to meet with them and see if there's a way we can resolve that. The noise, if any, is music on a stereo inside our barn in the back corner. Usually our weddings are done by 9. I mean, it's a long day. They leave. So I'm really not, that's my question, is to just like to know what the complaint is so that I could address it.
I'm sure folks have heard that. Thank you. All right, we're going to close the public comment portion of the discussion. This is Back Creek.
Mr. Chairman, I would move to approve the outdoor festival permit request of Waveland Farm LLC and Cynthia J. Lehman.
Heard the motion. Is there a second?
Mr. Chairman, I'll second it.
Second?
Just so that I can make a motion to amend it. I'd like to move to amend the motion to limit the size of any event to 100, because that was what the original contracts were supposedly predicated upon. So at the very most, I think there should be a limit of 100 people versus 152 people. Or 25 people, sorry.
Okay, so now we're discussing an amendment if we have a second. We have a second for the proposed amendment. Any? Afraid your proposed amendment will die for lack of a second, sir. All right, discussion. Motion to approve. Supervisor Lofton.
Mr. Chairman, I need to take responsibility, I think, for us being here at this point. When I was first contacted by the Layman's, based on what they had told me, I reiterated their permit code to them, and I'm afraid I may have misled them based on what I knew about the 100 people. But when we found out that it was going to be different, then that's when we started looking for alternatives to the entrance. And in that meantime, the Layman's, based upon the process that we have set out, and the CUP, which I, like I indicated, that I thought there was a resolution basically to the entrance, was my biggest problem with that. And so I think that's partly why we were here today, debating whether or not we should allow these three. I really do think we should. The Layman's have been diligently trying to resolve this issue. We know that the issue through the adjoining property was not the most desirable outcome, and so that was denied. The Layman's are still pursuing other avenues to get that done. This just gives them the flexibility to hold those events that they had already committed to. And as Mrs. Lehman has said, she and I met with VDOT, and later I contacted Sheriff Milholland. Sheriff Milholland actually came to the site. He sent a deputy to the site. He indicated that he felt that they had a plan where they could make the entrance and exit to the Lehman farm through their existing entrance safe. It has worked. So with that in mind, and the fact that Ms. Lehman has contracted with the Sheriff's Department to provide those services again, if we should approve these events, then I think that we ought to give them the opportunity to fulfill their commitment to these events. There are no houses except Painter's Hill, which is probably a quarter of a mile away to the closest house. And I myself have not heard any complaints from any of the residents in Painter Hill about noise, traffic, or any other issues that have been associated with the events that have been held there at that venue. So I think that we would be remiss if we would not allow them to finish out this year. If the CUP, as it comes back in, if you do not feel that it is a proper use for that farm, given all the circumstances that are associated with it, then that's fine. But I think that we should give them the opportunity to fulfill these commitments for this year and then work on their conditional use permit for the future.
All right, further discussion, anyone?
Mr. Chairman,
Supervisor Wells.
I spoke with Ms. Lehman on the phone, so she knows I did. And I expressed to her, and I've expressed before, and Mr. McCarthy, I think, feels the same way. CUPs are certainly not my favorite thing. We discussed that at the Planning Commission today, and there are certainly a lot of them. So I don't know how we control 100 people. West Oaks has a hard time controlling it. I was speaking with my wife this afternoon. I said, so, you know, you open up and people come and you get to 200, you have the guy there and he closes the gate and says, sorry, you can't come to this wedding because you're 200 and we can only have 199. That's not going to happen. There's going to be 250. There's going to be 150. There's going to be whatever. That's not up to the sheriff to do. He's just directing traffic, not counting cars or people coming in. So it's kind of ridiculous to put a number on it because you can't control the number. We can't control CUPs. It's pretty obvious in Frederick County we can't do that. We don't have the wherewithal. That being said, we allow it. It is on our books at this time, and that's what I told Ms. Lehman. Even though I don't like the idea, it has been permitted, and I certainly understand that. I've not heard any complaints about noise or anything like that. I'm not in that district, but haven't heard anybody complain about that. I am a little disappointed that we had events knowing full well that weren't supposed to have events, we did have events. That's disappointing, I must say. But anyway, I've said my piece. Thank you very much.
Further discussion, anyone?
Mr. Chairman,
Supervisor McCarthy.
I would reiterate Supervisor Wells' sentiment about being disappointed. You know, we have ordinances, laws for a purpose, and that's to make sure everyone's following the same rules, abiding by the same restrictions. And I'm sure there's a lot of folks out there that would like to do things and know that they don't have the proper permits or the proper CUP, so they don't do them. That being said, though, Supervisor Lofton mentioned that, you know, he feels that he may have some responsibility in a miscommunication with the applicant where they misunderstood what was required. And if these contracts were signed at that time, I can understand, too, the feeling that I have some contractual obligation to fulfill my duty to the people who signed the contract. That being said, it's really hard when I'm being told I understood I could have up to 100, but yet the application says 125. It's hard for me to approve this application for 125 people when the whole idea of why we're sitting here was predicated on the fact that I thought I could have up to 100. So if the contract was signed for up to 125, then there was an intentional sort of overstepping of what you were allowed to do. So I'm really torn here. It seems like every hour today, I'm kind of back and forth looking at this one, and it's a tough one. In one breath, I think we have an obligation as a board to uphold the ordinances and the law, and another, I think, you know, we have the obligation to look at things and say, is this an allowable use that will benefit a member of our community and not hinder someone else in our community? So it's this balancing act. At this point, I think based on what Supervisor Lofton said, I would be willing to vote in favor of these next 3 events. But I would just say, I hope that there will be no other events without a CUP, because it's a disservice not only to this board and flaunting those ordinances, but it's a disservice to all your community members who are abiding by those ordinances. You know, we're expected to hold each other to account and to abide by those laws. So as Supervisor Wells says, it's a real disappointment when we see that not happening. So I understand the circumstances, but the circumstances don't mean that you can do the wrong thing. So I'll vote in favor of this on these particular events, these next 3, but that's where I'm going to draw the line on this one.
Thank you, sir. Any further comments, anyone?
Yeah.
Supervisor Dunn.
Like Mr. McCarthy, I've wrestled with this for most of the day. I'm disappointed that after the board voted to deny a CUP, that there was another event after that. I was on Marlborough Road on the 7th, and I spoke to a policeman who said that there was an event that was occurring there. I'm also very cognizant of the fact that apparently you have a wedding scheduled for this Saturday. When we voted on the CUP before, one of the issues was traffic and coming over Marlborough Road. How do you prevent 4 or 5 cars that are about to turn left into your property from being rear-ended? And so when I was there earlier this month, I asked, and they had the lights on, et cetera. When I crested that hill, I had no idea what I was going to see, and the police officer was just literally there at the side, and he would not have known what was on the other side of the hill, too. So traffic was a big issue the last time we talked about this. If you had addressed the traffic issue in your first CUP and said, you know, how do we address this, I would have been more open to listen, but I'm really disappointed that after the board votes, that you just continue to have not only 2 others, but you're scheduled to have another 4, one of which is Saturday. And that's just frustrating. So therefore, Mr. Chairman, I'm going to make an amendment. The amendment would be that they can have one for this Saturday only, and that the next 2 need to be, they cannot have, and that you'd have to just go and find another venue. I think there's a bride and a groom. They're going to be very surprised tomorrow morning, depending on how this board votes. But I'm just disappointed that you couldn't go and comply. And if you were making business decisions, you could have at least said contingent upon something. But that's my frustration. So thank you, Mr. Judge. So I'll make the motion to see if there's a second.
You've heard the proposed amendment. Is there a second? Anyone? Sir, your amendment offer will die for lack of a second.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I do think that it's time that we back out, look at the big picture. I I think everyone's disappointed with the way this one has gone, including the community and the neighborhood. Get them through a year. I do hope that we see a conditional use permit application prior to anything happening after this that can be approved by the board. That's my opinion. Anyone else? Supervisor Lofton.
Mr. Chairman, just to wrap this up, I agree with your comments, and the layman's have indicated that this will wrap up their events for this year. Again, I know that they're diligently working on the next CUP application. Again, we've met with VDOT, we've met with the sheriff. We're trying to make sure that all the issues that have been raised are going to be addressed in that CUP application.
Further discussion, anyone? Supervisor Dunn.
Nay.
Supervisor Lofton.
Aye.
Supervisor Wells.
Aye.
Supervisor Slaughter.
No.
Supervisor McCarthy.
Aye.
1, 2, 3. The chair votes aye. The motion carries. The festival permit is approved as applied. Please don't disappoint us again. Thank you. All right. That will bring us to Planning Commission business. Proposed ordinance amendments. Mr. Klein.
Yes, sir. Good evening, Mr. Chairman, members of the Board of Supervisors. This is an ordinance amendment discussion for public utilities. This is a proposed amendment to Chapter 165, the zoning ordinance, to provide a definition for public utilities that includes utility-scale solar power energy generating facilities and provides additional supplemental regulations for specific uses that requires utility-scale solar generating energy facilities to make arrangements, including financial security, for decommissioning consistent with and as required by the Code of Virginia, and to provide site plan review and approval only for utility-scale solar power generating facilities. The intent of this text amendment is to codify a determination that utility-scale solar power generating facilities would be considered a public utility and to codify recent changes to the Code of Virginia to include decommissioning for solar energy facilities. This text amendment also cleans up terminology for public utilities throughout the zoning ordinance. The text amendment does not amend requirements for other types of utilities, including those facilities owned and operated by Frederick Water. The Development Review and Regulations Committee, or DRRC, discussed this item extensively at their June 27th, July 25th, and August 22nd regular meetings. The DRRC supported the proposed changes. The item then went to the Planning Commission for discussion on September the 4th, and they also discussed the item and recommended it go forward to the board for discussion. This item is presented to this body this evening for discussion, and staff is seeking direction from the board as to whether this item is ready to be sent forward to a public hearing. As the staff person to the DRC, I'm happy to answer any questions this board may have about this text amendment. Thank you.
Questions of Mr. Klein. Supervisor Lofton.
Mr. Klein, perhaps I've missed it here, but what can you give me a definition of utility scale? Solar.
Utility scale is going to be a type of facility where the power is generated to be sold back to another utility company. It would not be where someone is generating power for their own consumption, but where the power is being generated to be sold to a Dominion Power or another power utility company.
Do you think that definition should be included? Is there something here that tells me that?
The definition for public utilities is up, and that the definition that we've included is that they are power generating facilities, booster or relay stations, transformer substations, transmission lines and towers, pipes, meters, and other facilities, including utility scale solar power generating facilities and sewer and water treatment facilities, including sewer and water transmission lines. The key here is that such facilities may be owned by public utilities, public agencies, those operators with a certificate of public convenience, or those that are operating under a permit by rule.
So we have set, I think, a minimum of 6 acres to have solar generating facilities on?
We do not have a minimum acreage threshold as part of this amendment.
Do we have it someplace else in our code?
We do not. It was part of a previous text amendment that was not moved forward by the board, but this amendment does not specify a minimum or maximum acreage for such a facility.
But the definition would be that it's being sold to the grid, basically?
It deals with the ownership regarding public utilities, public agencies, similar agencies, or those operating with a certificate of public convenience.
Other questions, Mr. Clyde? Anyone?
Mr. Chairman.
Supervisor McCarthy?
I have two questions. One follows on Supervisor Lofton's question. That's the definition of public utility, not the definition of a utility scale solar power generating facility. I don't know if the state has a definition of that we can incorporate into the ordinance, which I would like to see. The second comment I have is when we say that they are selling the energy back to a utility versus using it for personal consumption. My understanding of most solar-powered arrays, even for residential, are not actually utilizing the power directly for their own personal consumption, but they're actually selling it back to the utility, which then rolls back their meter versus using it themselves. So can there be some clarification as to that aspect of it too, so that those residential uses, like even a large farm that might have a very large array, wouldn't fall under a definition of one of these utility-sized solar generating?
We certainly could look at incorporating such aspect to the definition and providing a separate definition for utility scale. If you recall, the county attorney and staff did provide a determination last summer about why we felt like utility scale solar could be lumped into the public utilities allowed use that's already spelled out in the zoning ordinance. At that time, we did not have a public utility definition, in which case we defer to Webster's dictionary. So the definition that's provided is an effort by staff and the county attorney to kind of codify what we believe our definition is. It also includes how it's spelled out in other parts of the ordinance.
And I appreciate that. I think if we could get a little bit more clarity in the ordinance itself, because I'm thinking, as I think to the future, for instance, a 20 kilowatt array could take up, the better part of an acre for a farm. And if I want to run a pretty large farm operation, I may need 100 kilowatts of energy from a solar array. So, I'm thinking, I don't want to see our local farmers in the future be hampered with using part of their acreage to help offset utility costs in order to run that farm. If we can simply just put some simple language in here that would exempt them from falling under this in any way.
I can defer to Mr. Williams, the county attorney. Our interpretation has been that people that are doing it on their private property, again, for specifically to power their individual property, where some of it may be sold back, would not fall under public utility, and Mr. Williams can clarify that, I believe.
Mr. Chairman, I think we can go either way on that. I understand, however, that the need or desire for a definition, we can certainly craft one. It certainly doesn't hurt. It's most likely more than adequate as it stands, but clarity is always a good thing. So we could come up with a definition that encompasses what Mr. Lofton and Mr. McCarthy suggested.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Tierney, did you want to?
Well, I'm honestly just sitting here pondering, but I'm wondering if in the end it becomes a irrelevant distinction, because if I'm using it to power my own farm, it's a by right use. So do we need to distinguish what I'm doing for my own personal consumption? What this does is make a utility scale and makes it clear that it is a public utility, which is also allowed by right. So both uses are allowed by right. We don't regulate them. I understand if we're going to use the term, we ought to know what we're saying. But in the end, they're both permitted uses.
Right. And I suspect we can find some clarity. But even those folks who have large arrays powering whatever it is that they choose to power with it, there are times when they're using it all plus buying some. There are times when they're getting credit for some, which is exactly what we're looking for. It's all positive stuff in my book. I happen to be 100% supportive of this. What I haven't found in all the documentation is a clearer definition of decommissioning and how we guarantee that over time. When does that come into play?
The supplemental,
Or did I miss it?
in the supplemental uses, we provide a statement regarding decommissioning, which refers back to the state code section. So those requirements are
Read the
outlined in the state code section.
I didn't find it in there either. Anyway, I support this step. I want to see that step accomplished and clarified, is all I mean by my comment.
Yes, sir.
Other discussion?
Mr. Chairman, just one, on the decommissioning, I had a conversation with staff earlier, but I would also support the chairman's comment that when the issue is finished, and if there's a decommissioning, that you return the land to the way it was meant to be, and that should be determined up front, that when the project is finished, it's reverted to, whatever's predetermined should be the end.
Decommissioning is a component of the permit by rule, which is a part of the solar application that applicants need to go through with the Commonwealth of Virginia. So their decommissioning plan is part of that. It's essentially a checklist. If they check all the boxes in the permit by rule, one of which is decommissioning, also stormwater management, they will satisfy the state code requirements, which would subsequently satisfy our supplemental uses as they're proposed.
And I'm just looking to make it certain that it goes back to the way it was before operation begins, that's all.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Yeah, I found that in the code. What I didn't find is how localities protect themselves against those folks who no longer exist or can be found. And I didn't find it in the state code either.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, sir.
The state code provision would require the owner to post some form of financial surety, a cash escrow, bond, letter of credit.
With the Commonwealth or with the locality?
The locality.
Okay. All right, good enough. Thank you. That was my concern. Further discussion, anyone? So the request is for adoption of a resolution, to hold a public hearing to move this forward.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, sir?
I would so move.
A motion, sir, a second. And a second. Is there further discussion? Supervisor McCarthy?
Aye.
Supervisor Slaughter?
Aye.
Supervisor Wells?
Aye.
Supervisor Lofton?
Aye.
Supervisor Dunn?
Aye.
Chair votes aye, and the motion carries. All right, thank you. Go ahead, Mr. Klein.
Yes. This is, again, an ordinance amendment for discussion in regards to conditional uses in the RA Rural Areas Zoning District. The purpose of this amendment is to add clarity to specific uses where the intensity of a given use is important in considering its appropriateness for a conditional use permit or CUP, and to provide consistency in the allowance and implementation of certain uses in the zoning district. The Board of Supervisors directed the Planning Commission to evaluate our conditional use permit process and those uses listed as conditional uses in the RA zoning district to ensure that the uses and the scale of the uses were appropriate for the zoning district in which they were allowed. This proposed amendment to the zoning ordinance further defines the conditional use country general store to exclude all fuel sales and to cap the maximum square footage allowed at 3,500 square feet. It also provides additional supplemental use regulations for specific uses, specifically the country general store. It eliminates, combines, and refines certain conditional uses on the conditional use list, and it codifies zoning determinations relating to home occupations, cottage occupations, and kennels to reduce the number of conditional use permit applications. The Development Review and Regulations discussed this item at their August 22nd regular meeting, and the DRRC supported the proposed changes. The Planning Commission discussed the item on September the 4th, and this item is presented to the Board of Supervisors for discussion. Following your discussion this evening, staff is seeking direction from the Board of Supervisors as to whether this item is ready to be sent forward for public hearing. Staff is available to answer any questions you may have. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, sir. Questions of Mr. Klein? Anyone? Yes, sir?
I guess were there specific incidents that brought forward, it appears that the convenience store, general store, whatever you want to call it, was the focus of a lot of this? Was that the genesis of this CUP revision? Were there more incidents of other uses that were discussed, or was that this basically the focus of the?
The Country General Store was the impetus for this discussion, but when we got into the conditional use list, we identified several uses that had never received conditional use permits. We identified several uses that were either duplicative or conflicting with one another. So what you'll see on the revised use list is some of those uses were combined, some that were no longer appropriate or didn't ever exist were eliminated, and others that we felt were no longer conditional uses became allowed uses. It shortened the list. The Country General Store, again, was the main impetus. A lot of Country General Stores were approved, and they subsequently became convenience stores with fuel pumps, and they were doing diesel sales and had hours of operation that conflicted with neighboring residential uses. So it was in order to kind of rein in that use in particular.
So, like I said, although that was the genesis, you did look at the whole basket of CUP then to narrow it down to what we have here?
Yes, sir. We looked at the last 20 years of approved uses to go through that, and then we also provided a comparison of some of the Country General Stores that are out there versus what they would be like in the suburban area of the county.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions of Mr. Klein, anyone?
I do have one.
Supervisor Slaughter.
When I look at Article 4 under agricultural and residential districts, you have stricken fruit packing plants. So I'm assuming the reason for that is because you're saying that over the last 20 years, there have been.
In certain instances in fruit packing plants, we just consider that under agricultural, which is an allowed use. So it was in order to make that use just allowed by right and not require a separate, because it's kind of accessory to other agricultural activities. So the permitted use agricultural activities encompasses a lot of activities, and some of those were stricken from the conditional list and just were lumped into that.
So more or less a by right use as opposed to something permitted under this article.
Yes, ma'am, that is correct.
Thank you.
Other questions of Mr. Klein, anyone? Okay. Is it ready to send forward to public hearing?
Mr. Chairman, I would move that we, I'm sorry.
Bob, go ahead.
I got his hand up first now. Which one of you want to go?
Go, Doug.
I'll make the motion to move it forward to public
Oh,
hearing.
okay. I thought it was another comment. Second?
Second.
All right. So, motion is second to send it forward to public hearing. Is there any further discussion? All those in favor, aye. Aye. Opposed, no. We'll send that forward to public hearing. All right. Great. Doesn't want to go. So, that brings us to board liaison reports. Are there any?
Mr. Chairman.
Supervisor Dunn.
So last week, the Northern Shenandoah Valley Regional Commission had a meeting in which we discussed not only Frederick County, but Frederick County and adjoining counties working together to deal with the recycling issue. As you know, we were trying to work through something by the end of this year. Other counties have a similar concern, so this regional commission is seeing what we can do as a collective group to try to address the recycling issues that affect all of us.
Thank you, sir. Any other board liaison reports, anyone? All right, seeing none. Citizen comments. This is the portion of the meeting we set aside for citizen comments on any issue whatsoever. Is there anyone who would like to speak? Anyone at all? Last call. Close the citizen comment portion. Board of Supervisors comments, are there any?
Mr. Chairman?
Supervisor Dunn.
In this community, which is rich in history, there was an opening last weekend on the Third Battle of Winchester. And there's a local gentleman, Mr. Wilkins, who donated a considerable amount of money to help with that opening. So I think we just have to appreciate people in this area that are willing to put their own dollars in for the greater good. At that battle also, there was a situation in which a Confederate soldier was shot and wounded in one of the attacks. A Union soldier then gave him a log to hide behind for the counterattack that was sure to come. And so that just shows how people can work together even though they're mortal enemies. In Lincoln's second Gettysburg Address, he talked about binding up the nation's wounds. And with the political fray that we have today, we need to do that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, sir. Further comments, anyone? Vice Chairman Lofton.
Mr. Chairman, I move we adjourn.
Motion to adjourn, is there a second?
Second.
We'll stand adjourned. We thank everyone for their time, attention, and their input.